That type of industry must be visible to any proper governmental oversight, and those offenders are not all operating in third world countries. It's not generally regarded as the role of law enforcement to police this trade, but I suggest it is serious organised crime. If you consider where resources and action should be applied in dealing with this type of serious organised crime that should be removed from the global picture in concert with other countries, would this perhaps be one of those types? It would be difficult, if not impossible at present, for the joined-up and coordinated approach necessary to combat this crime to be created using just individual national law enforcement agencies, however willing. That has not, of course, stopped some who've done outstanding work across international boundaries, and some of them, unfortunately, have found it's easier to seek forgiveness rather than permission for this work. And what are the legislation that governments can apply at national level? The stroke of the regulatory pen, as Simon said earlier, can often cause, but can also prevent, serious organised crime from operating far more effectively than concerted and large-scale law enforcement activity. But beware, there are drawbacks, and the law of unintended consequences applies in large measure in some cases. I said earlier that the mix of illegal and legal activity will be difficult to counter using current law enforcement techniques, and legislation can often provide plenty of sledgehammers that still fail to crack any nuts. It can also increase the pressure, unfortunately, to actually corrupt and suborn government and officials to get round it. It can also attract those with serious expertise to provide the knowledge and capability to overcome the legislation, and it therefore has to be handled with care. National security strategy should also address action designed to prevent and respond to new challenges. Now, some see this attack upon their nation as some form of invasion and naively seek to put an impregnable cordon around the country. This could be seen with many border protection control approaches which seek to put visible uniform presence ahead of designing out the abuses of the systems designed for the free transit of people in a democracy. I remember discussing cross-border and regional law enforcement activity with the head of a federal agency in a previously totalitarian state. His answer to the problem? More roadblocks, more checks on identity papers, and of course a few well-chosen and visible executions. When I asked what he was doing to improve his intelligence gathering capability for selective law enforcement activity that would provide more efficient and effective interdiction, he stared at me uncomprehending. Now, before we all join in with the condemnation of his approach, we should look at our own operating models. Are we seeking to address the causes or the symptoms of the threats to our country? Whilst we're focused upon those that A, we know about, and B, have the resources to tackle, what about those who we don't know about? And even if we did, the resources are not there to tackle. In my previous role, I advocated the development of a high-volume operating model as essential if law enforcement was to start to redress the balance with serious organised crime. Criminal justice interventions take months or years, are hugely labour-intensive, and the prosecution cases continue to tie up resources for years. They affect a very small proportion of those engaged in serious organised crime, and meanwhile there are a huge number of serious organised criminals able to operate untouched by law enforcement because the resources for a conventional approach against them are not available. High-volume operating models can be designed to provide monitoring and control without recourse to criminal justice activity. They've been highly effective in dealing with high-risk sexual offenders and other offending types. They provide control and monitoring which meets the needs of society without unnecessary breaches of human rights. There are many new and unconventional approaches being developed which are extremely cost-effective and manage the high volumes necessary, but they need partnership with government and other agencies of state to work. They are also, of course, revolutionary and unconventional tools which need a strategic overview of where they should be applied. National security strategies address the threats and what outcomes are desired. They can identify areas of common work and approaches that can deliver against those outcomes. They can force all of the resource holders in a country to look at joint working. Internationally, these strategies need to be joined up. Now, that will be extremely difficult between those countries that do not see some potentially important partners as strategic or even adhering to international law. This calls for huge international political effort of a very high order. The UN conventions show what we should be seeking in terms of desired outcomes and they now need to have the resources applied and the international will to drive them. But for those who have responsibility for national law enforcement, where are your national strategies for improving and developing your capability? In what areas will you look to develop? Difficult questions, and in too many cases they rely upon strong individual leadership or federal agencies that can enforce their mandate. In the absence of a national security strategy, there's little else that can be done. Law enforcers become a little uncomfortable at the thought of nationally and governmentally defined security strategies. Such a strategy will intrude upon the direction and control of law enforcement agencies, because to develop and manage a national security strategy you need three basic things: an oversight mechanism, measures of performance including an impact, and accountability. Now, the oversight mechanism has to be provided by specialist, knowledgeable and senior officials. You recognise all of those, don't you? In the counter-terrorism field, these are often specialists who've been seconded to the intelligence and security agencies at some time. In the military, there are long traditions of senior military personnel being included at this level. In law enforcement, the scene is very different. Law enforcement is seen as a blue-collar occupation, low-level and tactical. Everyone's seen the police series on the TV, so they're all experts. Non-specialist government officials who take a patrician view of the law enforcement proletariat manage law enforcement on behalf of ministers. That has to change if we are to really start to get the level of expertise available at senior government level and to develop effective law enforcement approaches for the strategic threats that we face. Measures of achievement and performance have yet to be properly developed for the serious organised crime end of the market. It's questionable whether they've been properly developed for any areas of law enforcement, but they certainly do not exist in an agreed format for serious organised crime. Instead, officials and ministers tend to rely upon easily measured data, such as the number of arrests, or the amounts of a commodity seized, or the money recovered. Demanding that they should develop an approach and analysis that focuses upon the harm prevented or the impact upon serious organised criminals or the environment that allows serious organised crime to operate draws puzzled stares. When resources questions are added, such as how effective has law enforcement been against organised crime for the amount spent, it's practically impossible to judge, and certainly there are few, if any, national or international comparators exist for benchmarking. Most of these government areas fall into that trap that the Irish always describe. One of my favourite sayings is that by continually weighing the pig, you do not make it fatter. Trying to find meaningful measures is a process where there are many elephant traps for the unwary. Measures tend to use old policing type activity as the basis, when modern law enforcement requires new, different and unconventional methodologies to deal with serious organised crime. It's also the case that this activity takes place in a long term and must be outcome focused and not output focused. This requires qualitative and complex research and analysis. Too often that's ignored when a quick answer to a question from a government or opposition member is tabled. A national security strategy starts from the premise of defining desired outcomes and should determine what success would look like across the national and international scene. Individual law enforcement actions and campaigns can then be judged against their effectiveness in prosecuting that strategy, rather than on the simplistic activity-focused approach. Accountability is often portrayed as determining where the buck stops. Well, a national security strategy determines that, and it stops with the government and those deployed to achieve against the national strategy. It imposes a discipline upon the government to determine what can and should be achieved in the light of that which the government is prepared to spend to achieve that aim. If resources are constrained or used elsewhere, there has to be a recognition that the government is prepared to see a level of crime in that area as being a tolerable level of criminality. Those types of considerations focus ministers' minds and take away the nonsense of expecting law enforcement to focus upon all priorities in the national threat assessment. If everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority. But it's lost on those who expect everything to be achieved with the minimum or even absence of resources and support. To these people, the model they employ is that of the carrot and the stick. Unfortunately, to many of us, it soon becomes clear that a carrot is simply a stick painted orange. Accountability also imposes a discipline on those leaders of law enforcement and other agencies charged with achievement of the national goals. No more can we allow the individual who achieves high office to believe that they've become their own master in their own fiefdom. Of course, none of us would recognise that vice in any of the law enforcement chiefs that we've known and loved. But this is where the wrong cry for accountability starts, because many see the office holders as pursuing their own agendas in their own ways, and there is no mechanism to prevent them from so doing. You will, I hope, now be well ahead of me when I say that, in my view, a national security strategy will be able to do something about that. Now, I hope that I've set out my stall for governments and law enforcement agencies to join together on strategies that nationally and internationally work to combat serious organised crime. There can surely not be anyone yet to be convinced that serious organised crime does not require a global approach. Simple examples such as drug trafficking and human trafficking are examples where, by their very nature, they require an international and joined-up approach. Yet still there is pressure on individual law enforcement agencies to focus only on the manifestations of this criminal activity within their own jurisdictions and not seek international cooperation. In the other crime markets that I've touched upon today, and of which you will hear a great deal more over the next couple of days, it's clear that as law enforcement professionals we now face an urgent need to cooperate in the gathering of intelligence, both strategic and tactical, to learn from each other and the methods we can employ to deal with this dynamic enemy, it's the jet lag, it's kicking in, and to urge governments and officials to see that this requires to be included within national security strategy responses, which have so far only included terrorism-related criminality. The final advantage of a national security strategy should not be missed. It is that alternate scenarios can be developed and considered in advance. This type of approach is widely practiced within the strategic private sector and will avoid those responsible for policy making and law enforcement strategic advisors to government from relying upon inductive assessments. It allows for critical uncertainties to be thought through and contingencies planned well in advance. And it sets out indicators of possible change that will provide advance warning of likely outcomes that can then be addressed. Government policy is not and can never be dynamic enough to match quickly changing market pressure. If it could, we wouldn't have an economic recession. What it can do, however, is to provide a framework within which appropriate strategic law enforcement can foresee and prepare responses to the enemy's dynamic change patterns, drawing legitimate support from all the other agencies of state and the private sector so as to alleviate and mitigate the impact from serious organised crime. At the next review opportunity, government is then able to take a considered view of that type of crime and the response required. The need for this approach is, I believe, imperative. International business is expanding exponentially. For the last few years, many have talked of the communications linkages and the global enterprises that will drive phenomenal business change in the world. Like all exponential curves, such change starts slowly but then accelerates. That is where the world is now. And business is changing so rapidly, it is hard for governments to oversee this change without drawing upon the expertise of specialists to brief them and produce detailed strategic plans. Serious organised crime is part of that business change. The mix of legitimate and illegitimate will only get more difficult to differentiate. If left unchecked at a national and international level, serious organised crime has more power to defeat good government, good business and millions of people's lives than many realise. It's moved beyond law enforcement alone having the capability and capacity to combat it, and that painful but inevitable fact has to be appreciated. I firmly believe that there exists within national law enforcement agencies a strong desire and a huge capability to impact upon serious organised crime. I also believe that the potential ability to impact significantly upon global serious organised crime is there also, but it must be strategically assessed, analysed, resourced and cooperation agreed across countries, and that requires governments to lead with the support of those of us in law enforcement who want to contribute to that success. Thank you.